Before you hear this story, hit subscribe, because what you're about to read isn't just shocking, it's a reminder that the richest people aren't always the ones with money, and sometimes the biggest miracles come from a note worth more than any tip. If you want more real-life twist stories that punch straight into the heart, subscribe now, you don't want to miss the next one. On a freezing Thursday night when the city's December lights blinked like tired eyes and cold air rolled through the narrow streets, 32-year-old single dad and waiter Lucas Hale stood outside Birmingham's upscale restaurant The Silver Crown, rubbing warmth into his hands as he replayed the morning's phone call from his son's school telling him that 8-year-old Milo's heart medication had increased in price again, meaning Lucas now had to find an extra $400 by Monday or risk the prescription lapse that could send Milo back into the and ever since he'd heard that number repeating like a curse, he'd walked around with a weight in his chest heavier than the trays he carried nightly. That evening, the restaurant buzzed with impossible Christmas cheer the way rich rooms always did, forced, glossy, artificial, while Lucas moved through it all with the quiet grace of a man used to being invisible, his apron already wrinkled from double shifts, his back aching and his mind bouncing between the hope of a decent tip and the quiet fear that tonight would be another disappointment, and just when he thought it would be a slow night, the hostess whispered that they had a VIP arriving, someone the whole staff knew by reputation alone. Graham Vance, the young billionaire tech investor whose face had been splashed on Forbes covers, podcasts, TED Talks, and harsh gossip spreads that painted him alternately as a genius, a monster, a recluse, a savior, depending on who was profiting from which story that week. Lucas had heard of him only because once, years ago, one of Graham's companies had donated educational tablets to schools, but none of that changed the fact that billionaires didn't come to restaurants like this to be kind. They came to be served, admired, worshipped, or tolerated, and so when Graham entered with a single bodyguard, dressed simply in dark jeans and a black coat dusted with snow, the room shifted in that strange way people move when power appears, and Lucas, unfortunately, was the server assigned to his table, even though he had been hoping to take only easy tables to move quickly and maybe sneak home early enough to read Milo a bedtime story through video call. But duty was duty, and so Lucas approached Graham's table with a polite smile he'd perfected over years of masking exhaustion, only to find the billionaire unusually quiet, staring at the tablecloth with a distracted look, as if his mind was somewhere far darker than the restaurant's warm candlelit atmosphere, and while placing a glass of water down, Lucas noticed that Graham's hands shook slightly, the kind of tremor that didn't come from cold but from either emotional strain or exhaustion, though he said nothing, simply took the man's order. A simple steak, medium, nothing fancy, no wine, no dessert, surprising for a billionaire, but Lucas didn't judge. Still, there was something off about the man's eyes, a tiredness or emptiness that seemed strange for someone the world idolized as untouchable. Through the dinner, Graham barely touched his food, barely looked around, and avoided small talk, giving only clipped replies until at one point he asked Lucas, "Do you have kids?" Completely out of context, catching Lucas off guard, making him stiffen before answering softly yes, one son, Milo, bright kid, heart condition, but doing his best, and he wanted to stop talking because he never shared personal details, yet something about Graham's expression, a mix of guilt and something else, made it oddly easy to speak the truth. When the dinner ended, Lucas hoped, prayed, because no shame remained when bills crushed a man, that maybe this would be the table that saved his week, that maybe billionaires at least tipped big even if they acted distant. But when he picked up the receipt after Graham left, his throat closed around disappointment like a fist. The man had left a $0 tip, not even an empty line, but a deliberate zero with a sharp cross through it, a gesture colder than the wind outside, and Lucas, after the longest 12-hour shift of his week, felt a spike of bitterness he normally swallowed as part of the job, but tonight it hit deeper because this wasn't just lost money, this was Milo's medication slipping further away. And as Lucas lifted the empty plate with trembling irritation, prepared to vent silently in the kitchen, he noticed something odd, a tiny folded paper quietly tucked under the edge of the plate, small enough to miss, but definitely placed with intention, and with a mix of suspicion and annoyance, assuming it was some arrogant message about customer service. He opened it and froze, the entire room suddenly sounding distant, because the note didn't contain sarcasm or elitism but a single sentence scrawled in quick handwriting. "If you want to change your life forever, meet me behind the restaurant in 10 minutes. Lucas stood in the hallway behind the kitchen gripping the note so tightly his knuckles whitened, unable to decide whether to laugh, panic, or throw it away, because the idea of some billionaire summoning him outside like a character in a spy film felt ridiculous, and part of him assumed it was a prank, maybe one of the younger cooks fooling around, yet something about Graham Vance's expression during dinner, that haunted look, the trembling hands, the sudden interest in whether Lucas had kids, tugged at him with an unease that didn't feel like coincidence, and after clocking out and tossing his apron into the laundry bin, he He exhaled and told himself he had nothing left to lose. The night was bitter, the alley behind the restaurant darker than usual with a broken street lamp flickering, and the wet pavement reflected distorted shapes of passing cars as Lucas stepped outside, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air, and for a moment he thought no one was there, until he noticed a black SUV parked slightly crooked near the loading bay, its engine running quietly, and leaning beside it without the earlier bodyguard was Graham, hands in pockets, staring at the sky as though searching for answers only the stars could give. Lucas approached cautiously, heart thudding, prepared to tell the man off for the zero tip, because exhaustion sometimes gave him courage he didn't normally have. But before he could speak, Graham said softly, "Thank you for coming. I didn't think you would," his voice noticeably different from earlier, more fragile, like someone whose defenses had finally cracked, and Lucas, too confused to be polite, asked bluntly what was going on and why the billionaire who'd stiffed him on a tip wanted to meet in an alley, and Graham offered a faint smile, the kind that wasn't happy but sad with an edge of resignation, as he confessed, "I didn't leave you a tip because I don't know if I'll be alive tomorrow," a sentence that struck Lucas like a shockwave, making him instinctively step back, unsure if he'd heard correctly, because nothing about the night made sense anymore, and Graham continued, explaining that earlier that afternoon he had received a medical call revealing that a genetic condition he'd ignored for years had progressed aggressively, leaving him with a high chance of sudden heart failure within months, or less, and though he could afford every doctor on earth, money couldn't reverse genetics, and for the first time in his life he felt powerless. Lucas, shocked and unsure how to respond, muttered an apology out of instinct, but Graham shook his head firmly and said he didn't share this for sympathy but because he needed to make a decision about what to do with the time he had left. And for reasons he didn't yet understand, something about Lucas and the way he spoke about his son had reminded him of a part of his own past he'd locked away, a past tied to a father who walked out when Graham was young and a mother who worked 3 jobs while he was too busy building tech empires to appreciate how hard her life had been, and now, facing his mortality, he found himself drawn not to other billionaires or partners or shareholders, but to ordinary people who fought every day for their families with a strength he felt he had never possessed. Lucas didn't know what to say to this overwhelming confession, especially standing in an alley behind a restaurant, so he simply asked, "What does any of this have to do with me?" And Graham inhaled slowly, then opened the SUV door, pulling out a sealed brown envelope, thick and slightly worn at the edges, and handed it to him, saying, "Because I need someone honest. Someone with integrity. Someone who knows what it's like to struggle but still show kindness. I watched you. You didn't complain. You didn't break. You deserve more than a life of scraping tips for your son's survival. Open it," urging him gently. With trembling fingers and a knot of dread and hope tangled together, Lucas tore the seal and pulled out several documents that at first meant nothing, legal papers, property deeds, and bank authorizations, until his eyes fell on the first line. Transfer of ownership. Recipient: Lucas Hale. Amount: $5 million, and his lips parted in disbelief as he glanced at Graham, who explained that he intended to give away the majority of his assets before his condition worsened, choosing individuals personally instead of charities or foundations, because he wanted to see the impact while he was still alive. But most importantly, he wanted at least one person to have the life he wished someone had given his mother, and tonight, after watching Lucas work silently while carrying invisible burdens, he felt certain he had found someone worthy. Lucas, overwhelmed, immediately stepped back and insisted there must be a mistake, that Graham barely knew him and this was insane, but Graham countered with a firm, almost desperate sincerity that made Lucas's chest tighten. "I'm dying. I know it. But before I go, I want to see a father win. I want to see a kid grow up with a chance. Let me do this. You'd be helping me more than I'm helping you," he said with a trembling voice, and something about the loneliness behind those words made Lucas stop arguing, though he still couldn't understand why fate had suddenly flipped upside down. Then, as though fate wanted to twist harder, a shout echoed from the alley entrance. The restaurant manager, furious, demanding to know why Lucas was still outside talking to a customer. And before Lucas could explain, Graham stepped forward calmly, introducing himself with the weight of his name, instantly silencing the manager, and with measured authority stated that Lucas would no longer be working at the restaurant as of tonight because he was being hired immediately as Graham's personal liaison, a vague title the manager didn't dare question because of who was speaking. The manager's face paled, realizing he'd just walked into something far above his pay grade, and Graham, without another word, gently guided Lucas toward the SUV and said, "There's more you need to know, and it can't wait," leaving Lucas bewildered, breathless, and frightened but unable to deny the sense that his entire life had just changed in a single hour. And as the SUV door closed behind him and the city lights blurred through the window, he couldn't shake the feeling that this bizarre miracle carried shadows he didn't yet understand. The SUV moved smoothly through the frozen city as Lucas sat stiffly beside Graham, heart pounding at a rhythm that alternated between hope and terror, and though the billionaire's face was calm, there was a storm beneath it, a heaviness that felt like it had been waiting years to spill out, and soon enough Graham explained that his situation was far more complicated than the envelope suggested. He confessed that the reason he had come to the restaurant alone, looking pale and shaken, was not only because of the diagnosis but because earlier that day he had survived an attempted corporate sabotage from within his own executive circle. Board members who had learned about his failing health through leaked medical files and were preparing to strip him of control of his own empire under the guise of protecting shareholder value, a betrayal that had cracked something deep inside him, and as if that weren't enough, he'd also discovered that the childhood home he secretly owned under a private trust, a house his late mother had adored, was at risk of being sold and demolished by the same board before he could intervene. These revelations had left him feeling like everything he had ever built was crumbling, and in that fragile moment he had walked into the Silver Crown needing silence, needing to disappear for a moment, and instead he found Lucas, a man working tirelessly, quietly, kindly despite hardship, someone who reminded him of the world he had come from before billions had redefined him. As the SUV stopped outside a secure high-rise, Graham led Lucas into a private suite where floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city like a glittering ocean, and once inside, Graham pulled out another folder, more worn than the first, and handed it to Lucas, saying gently, almost pleadingly, "Before you decide whether to accept anything from me, you need to hear the second truth." And when Lucas opened the folder, he found a photograph of a woman holding a baby boy, and for a moment he didn't understand why Graham was giving him a picture of strangers, until Graham whispered, "That's my mother. And the baby is me." But look at the handwriting on the back, and Lucas turned it over, breath-catching when he saw a name scribbled there. Sarah Hale, a name painfully familiar because it was also the name of Lucas's own late mother, and confusion swirled violently as Graham explained that decades ago his mother had shared a short but profound friendship with a woman who worked at a small cafe. A kind woman who brought her free meals when she was struggling, a woman she had wanted to keep in touch with but lost contact with after moving. That woman, Graham had only learned hours ago while digging through old documents, was Sarah Hale, Lucas's mother. The truth hit Lucas like a physical blow, the weight of coincidence suddenly reshaping itself into destiny, and he collapsed onto the couch, head spinning, as Graham continued with quiet urgency, saying that when he saw Lucas's last name on the restaurant receipt, something had pulled at him but he hadn't made the connection until reviewing the folder later that night, realizing that the man he had chosen instinctively was not random. Their mothers had been connected by kindness years ago, and now fate had placed their sons in the same place decades later. Lucas was shaking, overwhelmed by the idea that their families had once been intertwined, and the thought that maybe this wasn't some bizarre luck but something deeper, something almost cosmic, made his throat tighten painfully. But before he could speak, the suite door suddenly burst open and two men in suits stormed inside, members of the Vance Global Board who had been tracking Graham's disappearance, shouting that he was violating emergency restrictions placed on him due to his unfit medical condition, and they demanded he return immediately to sign documents relinquishing temporary control. Lucas stood up instinctively to shield Graham, though he had no idea what he was doing, and the board members sneered at the sight of a restaurant waiter in the penthouse, mocking Graham for bringing charity cases into corporate affairs, and something in Graham snapped. A fierce clarity ignited in his eyes as he declared that not only was he refusing to sign anything, but he was officially designating Lucas Hale, the son of the woman who once saved his mother from starvation, as an emergency trustee of a portion of his assets, someone the board legally could not push aside without triggering a public scandal or court battle. The board members' faces twisted with fury as they realized their trap had shattered, and after several tense minutes, security arrived and escorted them out, leaving the suite silent except for Graham's trembling breaths as he sank into a chair, overwhelmed not just by adrenaline but by the seriousness of his condition. Seeing him struggle, Lucas knelt beside him, asking what he needed and whether he should call a doctor, but Graham simply smiled weakly and said, "No one has stood up for me in years. You're the first. That's worth more than any medicine," and the raw honesty in his voice made Lucas's eyes sting. He remembered his own son waiting at home, the little boy who still drew superheroes on scrap paper, and he realized he couldn't let this man fall apart alone, not after all he'd confessed, not after their mother's connection, not after the near collapse of everything Graham had fought to protect. Over the next several hours, as night slowly surrendered to dawn, Lucas stayed beside him, helping him contact ethical doctors, helping him review documents, helping him fight back against the corporate coup, and with every passing moment their bond deepened, not as billionaires and waiters, but as two sons raised by mothers who had understood kindness long before wealth or hardship complicated life. When morning light spilled across the room in soft gold, Graham handed Lucas a final envelope, thinner, gentler, containing a letter addressed to Milo, written in Graham's elegant handwriting, telling the young boy that sometimes heroes are just fathers who never give up, and inside the envelope was a simple key. The key to his mother's childhood home, which Graham had vowed to protect, now gifted to Lucas and Milo as a place of safety, warmth, and legacy. Months passed in a breathtaking blur of struggle and triumph. Lucas transitioned into his new role as liaison and advisor, learning the world of high-stakes business with surprising confidence, while Graham, with the help of world-class physicians, received a rare treatment that slowed the progression of his condition, giving him years instead of months, enough time to rebuild his company ethically, enough time to create a foundation dedicated to families like Lucas's, enough time to become the man he wished he had been earlier in life. Milo adored him, calling him Uncle G, and together the three of them would visit the old house on weekends, restoring it room by room while sharing stories of the two mothers whose kindness had unknowingly shaped their destinies. And in the greatest twist of all, after months of fighting the corporate takeover, the final court ruling came in their favor. The board members responsible for the sabotage were fired, charged with fraud, and replaced by a new team handpicked by Graham and Lucas, making Vance Global more ethical, more human, more compassionate than ever before. Years later, when Graham stood on a stage accepting a humanitarian award, not for wealth, but for transforming lives, he publicly credited one man, Lucas Hale, the waiter he once left a $0 tip for, the man whose strength had saved him, the man whose kindness reminded him of his mother's love. And in that moment, with the audience roaring in applause, Lucas held Milo's hand tightly, remembering the bitter night behind the restaurant, the cold alley, the strange note under the plate, and he whispered to his son, "Sometimes miracles come disguised as disappointments, because in a world full of billionaires and battles and broken hearts, no one could have predicted that a zero tip would become the beginning of a friendship, a legacy, and a life-changing bond that would ripple through generations, proving once again that fate doesn't always choose the richest, the strongest, or the most powerful, but instead often chooses the kind, the humble, and the ones who never stop fighting for the people they love."